I woke up abruptly on that specific morning to a rough, intentional shove. I groaned, assuming my sister was waking me up in her usual abrasive manner. It was early, around 7:30 a.m. As I groggily stepped out of bed, I was immediately hit by an overwhelming, cloying cloud of hairspray fumes. Someone was already in the bathroom, as I could hear the distinct hiss of a can being repetitively sprayed, followed by the sound of the shower turning on. I walked to the dresser, feeling the heaviness of sleep still clinging to me, and pulled out a blouse and a skirt. As I was getting dressed, I heard a distinct knocking on my door. I hurried, pulling my top fully on, and opened it. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. I was genuinely creeped out, but I tried to rationalize it. I was barely awake. Maybe it was my imagination playing tricks on me in a new place. I shrugged it off and exited the bedroom. As I passed the main lavatory, I heard the shower shut off, followed by the unmistakable heavy tread of my father's footsteps inside. Further down the hall was another restroom. The familiar, repetitive spritzes of hairspray were now coming from that room. I called out, "Hey Mom, I need to pee, and Dad's in the other bathroom." I heard my mother's voice immediately respond, "Alrighty." It was definitely her voice, but alrighty was not a word my mother had ever said. It was strange, but again, I was tired and dismissed it with a roll of my eyes. I figured I should probably wake my granddad too, as I could hear heavy snores coming from the room he was sharing with my parents. I wondered briefly why my parents hadn't already woken him up, given all the noise they were making. When I opened the door to their room, I froze in terror. The room was completely empty. No snores, no bodies. At that exact moment, all the noises, the shower, the footsteps, the spraying, ceased instantly. The heavy smell of hairspray vanished. The air felt sudden and terribly still. I ran downstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the hotel's dining area, I saw my entire family, my dad, mom, granddad, and my sister Clarissa, already eating breakfast. I checked my watch, stunned to see that it was now 10 a.m. I was missing hours of the morning. My mom stared at me, a confused look on her face. "What?" she started. My sister interjected, "What the heck?" I asked them what was wrong. My sister pointed to the lavatory near the small kitchen area and said, "You literally just went to the bathroom." Confused and shaken, I walked over to that bathroom door and pressed my ear against it. Sure enough, someone was inside, washing their hands. I took a deep breath and counted my fingers, 10 of them. I wasn't dreaming. I knocked loudly on the door. From inside the bathroom, a voice called out in response. It was my voice, calling out, "Alrighty." I spun around to look at my family. Every single one of them, parents, sister, granddad, were pale, staring at me in absolute shock. Behind my back, I heard the click of the lock. Then I heard my own voice say, "Hey there, Sarah." I heard footsteps. I turned around just in time to see my own feet, clad in my signature black velvet flats, turning the corner on the staircase. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move, think, or speak. I stood there for a full minute before I was finally able to gasp out the story of what had just happened upstairs. The true horror, though, was my sister's face. She told me that the day before, she had woken up and I wasn't in my bed. She had heard noises in the bathroom. When she checked, she saw me in my pajamas walking down the hall and called out my name, but I kept walking. When she ran back to my room frightened, she found me still sleeping soundly in my bed. She had been too scared to tell anyone until now. This happened years ago, but I have never forgotten that hotel, the missing time, the voice that wasn't mine, and the black velvet flats disappearing around the corner. We never found out what it was, but I know what it saw. This incident happened to me 2 years ago when I was 14, and to this day, thinking about it sends a cold shiver down my spine. It was around 10 p.m., and I was glued to my computer screen, struggling through a mind-numbing chemistry assignment. After 2 hours of staring at formulas, I decided I needed a break and started watching some videos. My desk was positioned a few feet away from the window, but since it was right to my left, I could clearly hear every rustle and whisper from the darkness outside. Suddenly, a distinct footstep crunched against the ground outside. I froze for a second, but quickly dismissed it, telling myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps a sound from the video I was watching. I closed the browser and tried to focus back on my chemistry work, but the silence of the house only made the next sound louder. Another footstep. I tried to ignore it again, but then came a faint, chilling laugh followed by a heavy step that sounded terrifyingly close. I gathered my courage, went to the window, and peered out, but the yard was empty and swallowed by shadows. Frightened, I ran to my father's study and told him someone was outside. He didn't believe me, of course, calling me paranoid and claiming I was just misinterpreting the sounds from my computer. After my persistent pleas, he reluctantly grabbed a torch and went out to investigate. He returned minutes later, casually mentioning that a neighbor was working in his garage and that was likely the source of the noise. I didn't buy it. The neighbor's garage didn't explain that haunting laugh, but I decided to call it a night. By midnight, I finally finished my assignment and crawled into bed. Surprisingly, the house was silent, and I began to convince myself that maybe my father was right. I am usually a very heavy sleeper, but that night an inexplicable restlessness kept me tossing and turning. Eventually, I drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was that laugh again. My phone showed exactly 3 a.m. My bed was positioned much closer to the window than my desk was, and the room was pitch black. Trembling, I reached for my phone and flicked on the flashlight, aiming the beam toward the glass. What I saw haunts my nightmares to this day. There, with her face pressed flat against the window pane, was a woman. Her skin was smeared with blood, and her eyes were a terrifying bloodshot red. When she opened her mouth, I saw rows of unnaturally sharp teeth, and she was laughing silently at me. I let out a blood-curdling scream, and in a blink, she vanished into the night. My parents rushed in, but once again, my father found nothing outside and insisted it was just a nightmare. The next morning, however, the truth came out. My brother and cousin were playing in the yard right under my window when they discovered a tattered white cloth and an old, weathered photograph lying in the dirt. When they showed it to me, I nearly collapsed. The woman in the photograph was the exact same woman I had seen pressed against my glass the night before. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget the sight of those sharp teeth and the silent laughter at 3 a.m. I have only ever had one encounter with the paranormal in my life, and frankly, I thank God every day that it was the only one. Even now, at 15, I remember every chilling detail as if it happened yesterday. It took place back when I was about 7 years old, shortly after my mother remarried and we moved into my stepfather's house in Alberta, Canada. For the first few months, life was perfect. I was doing well in school and making new friends, but that peace was shattered one Friday night that began just like any other. My older sister, Maddie, and I had stayed up late watching Futurama. Our parents let us stay up until 12:30 a.m., and I finally drifted off around 1 a.m. with my pit bull, Kush, curled up at the foot of my bed. I woke up suddenly and checked my tablet. It was exactly 3:05 a.m. After a quick trip to the restroom, I hopped back into bed, ready to fall back asleep. However, I noticed Kush wasn't relaxing. She was standing perfectly still, staring intensely at my closet door. I petted her and whispered that everything was okay, but she remained tense, the hair on her back standing straight up. Her anxiety began to bleed into me, making me feel a conscious sense of dread. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. As I stepped toward the closet, Kush began to growl with an intensity I had never heard before. I slowly pulled open the door. Inside, among my hanging clothes and old teddy bears, sat the rocking chair my mother used to hold me in when I was a toddler. Sitting in that chair was a young woman. She was beautiful, humming a soft tune while focused on her knitting. For a moment, I was mesmerized by her grace, but then the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavy, vibrating with a strange, dark energy. The moment Kush broke into a frantic, crazed bark, the lady's sweet smile vanished. She stopped knitting and stared down at the floor, her face twisting into a deep, hollow frown. I stood there, paralyzed by shock, wondering why my parents hadn't burst in yet. Kush had jumped off the bed and backed toward the hallway door, refusing to get any closer to the closet. That movement seemed to trigger something. The woman stood up with impossible speed and charged toward my dog, screaming at the top of her lungs with her arms outstretched. Just then, the bedroom door flew open. My stepfather burst in with a baseball bat, immediately scooping me up and scanning the room. The woman was gone. I couldn't even find the words to explain what I had just witnessed. Kush was physically unhurt, but she shook for 2 days straight and refused to step foot upstairs for a week. She never entered my room again. We moved out a year later, and though I've lived in many houses since, I still can't look at an open closet door without wondering if someone is sitting inside, waiting to stop their knitting. A few summers ago, I stayed at my boyfriend's aunt's mansion in Stockholm. It was a grand, imposing place, designed with massive mirrors in every hallway and balcony to create an illusion of infinite space. But to me, it felt less like a mansion and more like a labyrinth of shadows. One night, around 2 a.m., I developed a sudden, inexplicable craving for cherries from a basket in the central hall. To get there, I had to navigate a dimly lit corridor, cross a terrace, and descend a spiral staircase covered in red carpet. My heart was already pounding, so I made a plan. I would focus only on my feet, avoid looking at the mirrors or paintings, and ask my boyfriend to keep talking to me from the bedroom so I could hear his voice the whole time. As I stepped out, he began narrating the story of Little Red Riding Hood. I was laughing as I left the room, but the atmosphere shifted quickly. The house was deathly silent and unnaturally cold. As I moved further down the corridor, the plan began to fail. My boyfriend's voice started to fade, and my own footsteps on the wooden floor sounded deafeningly loud. I kept my eyes on my feet, but I could still see my reflections in the peripheral mirrors. My ears became hypersensitive, picking up every rustle of my clothes. Just before I reached the terrace, a sudden impulse hit me. I looked directly into a mirror. To my horror, the parallel mirrors on the walls created an infinite reflection of me, and in each subsequent reflection, my face looked more distorted, twisting into something unrecognizable. Panic seized me. I sprinted 10 feet toward the balcony, but then I heard it. A faint, raspy whisper right in my ear. "Sherry." I screamed and collapsed into a corner, my back pressed against the wall. After a few seconds, I tried to rationalize. I heard my cousin on the phone nearby. The lights were bright. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I took off my slippers to move silently, said a quick prayer, and bolted back to the bedroom. I burst through the door to find my boyfriend calmly finishing a completely different story, the miller, his son, and their donkey. I was confused. I had been gone for what felt like forever. He told me he realized Red Riding Hood was too grim, so he had switched stories the moment I left the room. My blood ran cold. If he had switched stories immediately, whose voice had I been hearing in the hallway narrating the wolf's attack? When I told him about the infinite reflections, he led me back into the hall to prove me wrong. There were no parallel mirrors. The mirrors were only on one side of the wall. It was impossible to see an infinite reflection there. And yet, I know what I saw, and I certainly know what whispered my name.